episode of China Unscripted, China's economy is spiraling out of control. The CCP can't stop it without creating more problems. Is economic collapse on the horizon? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And Chris, I'm so happy you're able to join us again. You know, I thought you were going to live in the pocket dimension and rule it for life as supreme leader.
Turns out they have some very strong ideas about freedom and independence in the pocket dimension. I had to flee. So back to conquesting this dimension.
Through a podcast?
Hey, it's all I got. And joining us today is Christopher Balding. He's a senior fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He's also the founder of new Kite Data Labs, a small think tank focused on China, data, technology, and the economy. Chris, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So recently, you said China's economy is reaching escape velocity. What does that mean?
So basically, if you think about it, and actually I had some physics nerds on Twitter beat me up that what I really should have said was event horizon, not escape velocity. So
that's impossible. Physics nerds can't beat up anyone.
So be careful of those physics nerds. So what we mean by that is the problems in China, as we've all talked about, and with you a couple of times over history, all the problems in the Chinese economy as they've progressively gotten worse. Basically, their choices have become narrower and narrower, and so basically they've reached escape velocity in the sense that they cannot go back and reform their economy to correct these issues. They're going to have to accept the pain. And so basically it's a choice now between, do you want a really, really bad choice or a catastrophic choice?
So when the physics nerd said you actually meant event horizon, you're saying that China is about to be sucked into an economic black hole.
To a degree, yes.
Yeah.
And so it's basically just how severe are those problems going to be? And I should say I'm not a believer in the crisis scenario. I think it's much more likely that there will just be really severe problems that the CCP works to make sure that there is not a crisis. But that does not mean that everything is going well. It's just it's not good, but it's not necessarily a crisis.
Well, can we talk about a few of those individual economic problems China's facing? Maybe let's start with real estate. That seems to be the biggest one, or one of the biggest.
Yes. So basically, real estate in China, to start off with, is wildly overvalued. I was just looking at these statistics yesterday. As a country, on average, Chinese, what a good easy metric to look at, real estate values is home values in China are roughly 25 times what income is. Okay.
Wow.
If you think about, I don't know what New York is. I know San Francisco is about 15. Like Paris is 20. If you look at it as a country, the United States is about 5 times income. Okay, so the average income might be about $100,000, and the home price would be $500,000 or something like that, as a simple scenario. In China, the urban value of income is about, let's say, a little over 1 million RMB, and the urban income is 40,000. Okay, so that pencils out at about a little above 25 to 30 times the income. And so that just makes it really hard for people to buy real estate in China. And one of the things that we've seen in the past couple of years is everybody talks about the market in China, but basically there's so few transactions going on in China that there almost is no market. And so, for instance, if you look at it, China, in the United States, most homes will sell on average about every, let's say, 6 to 8 years, depending, because that data can be kind of noisy. But in the United States, homes will sell on average every 6 to 8 years. Okay. Right now, the number of transactions taking place in China mean that it would take almost 50 years for every home in China to sell once. That's how few transactions
Wow.
there are. So when we talk about the market, there really isn't a market in the sense that you could go and sell your home in China. Okay.
Right. So that means that if you invested your entire life savings into an apartment in Beijing or something, like you might still not be able to sell it, so you can never get your money out, and then essentially your money is gone.
Yes, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. And so one of the things, there's on Chinese social media, there's actually been messages passed around where people, for whatever reason, they just want to walk away from a mortgage. And so they're trying to actually give real estate away, and they can't do that. And so people have taken to, there's official sanctioning of selling homes at beneath certain price levels and things like that. So, there's jokes around that, we're not changing the value of real estate because you'll buy one, you'll get two free. Okay. You'll buy one, get one free for apartments or something like that. So you're not actually changing the price of the real estate, but we're making a deal where you buy one, get one free.
Why can't the government allow people to change the price of the real estate?
So a couple of reasons. The primary reason is they're honestly very and deeply and rightfully scared of Chinese homeowners. One of the most common reasons on public demonstrations, gatherings, that I forget the exact term that they use for protests in China, but one of the most common reasons for those is basically developers trying to sell homes at beneath the price that other people bought in that development or in that building or in the general neighborhood bought for. That's one of the most common reasons. There's also the very real reason for governments is that this affects their tax revenue. On average, about 30% of government revenue in China comes from land sales. So the government oversees a city, a county, whatever, and they actually sell with like something like anywhere from typically about a 50 to 100-year lease to a developer to build on that property. And so one of the things people don't understand is that when a Chinese buyer buys an apartment or a home in China, and it depends on different cities and things like that, but on average, about 50% of that purchase price is actually effectively a tax that goes to the government. And this is a fact that the Chinese home buyers are very well aware of. And so one of the questions that has always been is, why don't local governments go to a more sustainable tax base and do things like implement a property tax or things like that? The very common example is in a lot of the United States, it's very common to have something around a 1% property tax. So that if you, for instance, have a $500,000 home, you would pay a $5,000 yearly tax to the city or county or something like that to pay for schools, other things like that. In China, they've basically already got that payment up front, and it's typically been a very large number. So if you, for instance, buy, the average price in China for a home right now is about 1 million RMB. So if you pay 1 million RMB for a home, and 50% of that goes to the government, that's probably about a $75,000 tax that goes to the government before you've even moved in. Okay. And so this is one of the reasons the government has found it very difficult to implement property taxes. The government is, as land sales have collapsed in China, that's creating an enormous problem for the local governments. So the local governments have a very vested interest in keeping those property values high so that they can continue to sell land to the developers to build more developments, even if nobody lives there. And so this gets into one of the bigger overall themes that we kind of touched upon earlier, is that the choices that governments at the local level, at the central level have are increasingly bad options.
Well, so I think this is important. Is this happening because, it's just one of those things that happens in a country where things, over time get a little chaotic, or is this situation the result of specific communist policies by the government?
So this is actually this is directly a result of the communist policies. After the 2008 global financial crisis, and this is 15 years ago now, I moved to China in 2009, and China was unleashing a massive stimulus at the time to keep everybody employed out of the global financial crisis. In fairness, the United States also released a stimulus package out of the global financial crisis. And that stimulus package amounted to about 1% of US GDP at the time. China's stimulus package amounted to roughly 10% of GDP at the time. And I remember very clearly in, I think it was 2010, maybe 2011. I have to go back and check the exact date. I remember very clearly, I was relatively very new to China, living in China. And I remember reading a local paper and seeing that new debt issuance by banks had tripled year over year. Okay. Not 3%, not 30%, had tripled year over year. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, like, wow, this is not going to end well at some point. Okay. And basically, for the past, since the global financial crisis, Chinese debt has just absolutely exploded. Just absolutely exploded.
And so this is why you say it's like an event horizon. It has reached that point where you can't escape the pull of the black hole.
Yes, you absolutely cannot. And so, the example I would use is, let's assume that you're in your 40s and okay, you're a few pounds overweight, and your doctor says, you know what, you should start exercising. And you come back in a couple of years and you've still enjoyed a few more donuts and hamburgers than you should have, and so you're a little bit more overweight. And as this goes on, at some point your doctor is going to tell you, you know what? Look, the only option for you is a quadruple bypass. You can't go exercise. You'll have a heart attack. Okay. China has reached that point where the only options left are bad options. You may have heard in China world and in economic pundit world, people saying things like, well, China needs to just stimulate households more. And that's actually reasonable. And China has actually released some policies in the real estate area where I'll get to in a second, which actually kind of try to move that forward a little bit. But it's really hard because Chinese households are now so wildly indebted that that they're incredibly constrained. They can't go out and buy real estate. Okay, they can't do a lot of these things because of how severe the underlying problems are.
So I want to compare a little bit about China's bailout to the U.S. because after the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. bailout, I mean, there was some of it which was direct checks to citizens, but that was a very small amount. Most of the money was through quantitative easing, which is essentially the Fed issuing additional currency that then ended up really boosting stock prices. And so the stocks went up, but sort of artificially, right? So the price to value ratio went up. And we didn't really see a lot of consumer inflation, but we saw inflation in assets. And those assets included a lot of luxury goods, fine art, and so on. But real estate was one of the big, I don't know if I want to say winners, but it was one of the things that went up, right? Because when people of a certain class, that is the investor class, has this additional money, because that's ultimately how the stimulus worked, that money goes into real estate, not consumer spending. And so that was the U.S. bailout. You're saying China's bailout was 10 times greater. Was it done in a similar way? Or was, what is it about that bailout that led to these massive increases in real estate prices?
Sure. So basically what China did at the time is basically the baseline stimulus number was, I forget the exact number, maybe it was about a couple $100 billion US dollars, maybe 3, 4, maybe even 500 billion. I forget the exact number. But what they did is they crafted it so that local governments got that money. They had projects that they were going to work on, and they actually were told, go to the banks, use the money we're giving you as basically the equity portion, borrow from the banks to then go out and build roads, bridges, apartment buildings, things of that nature. So the overall package was 3 to 4 times, once you counted the bank money, that these local governments added to the equity portion that they got from the government.
Okay, so that's essentially why there's also a massive increase in debt.
Yes, absolutely. Because what happened was, I forget who said it, but was this linked to CCP policies? And yes, it was. The seeds were absolutely directly sown from the CCP policies, because now you had local governments that were dependent upon this money. They were dependent upon the banks to fund these projects. You had the construction companies that were absolutely dependent upon this revenue, that employed enormous numbers of people, and they had to hit, the local governments had to hit their GDP targets. So they started hitting their GDP targets. Growth took off, and so every time in subsequent times that growth started to decline a little bit, the central government would say, "Hey guys, we're close to not hitting our targets. Go out, borrow money, build more bridges, build more apartment buildings, things like that." And so it was basically this vicious cycle that, they wanted to hit their targets, go out, borrow more, build something, even if nobody's going to use it, go out, borrow more, so that we can hit our targets. And it became this very vicious cycle.
And I think what's interesting about that is over these past, well, basically since the 2008 financial crisis, you had a lot of influential business leaders, like I'm thinking Michael Bloomberg, to an extent Elon Musk, pointing to China and saying, "Hey, look, they can build bridges, they can do all these things that we can't do. We should take China as a model." And you're saying it was not a good thing.
So I think specifically on what they were doing, the entire infrastructure model in China was build it in anticipation of growth. Okay, so that if we have a couple of years where people aren't going to be using it heavily, then that's okay, because growth is going to catch up, and in a couple of years there's going to be growth to support that. But what's happened is, and the stories are just legendary, some of these things, of just every town, has a massive, airport. Okay. Well, you know what? Not every town needs a massive international airport. The amount of high-speed rail that got built, and in places that really couldn't support it. And if you recognize that that's going to have to be an ongoing tax expenditure to support a project, then that's okay. We do that here in the United States. They do that at times in China. But if you're going to say, "Hey, here's a bridge, a road, whatever it is," that has to pay for itself in some way. Maybe it's fees, and then maybe it's also subsidies from the government budget. But China didn't account for ongoing subsidies that they would have to pay for a lot of this infrastructure that was built.
Well, I think also another side of this is the propaganda side of this. Because imagine if you're like a Chinese person who has survived probably barely, like the Great Famine or the Cultural Revolution. You've seen China with nothing, no food even, and now suddenly everything's being built up. Oh, my little town has an airport. The party is doing great.
That's absolutely correct. There is absolutely an enormous pride in this, and one of my most enduring memories just of China is the number of times I would see elderly, and one of the book projects, to be honest, I wanted to do at some point, which I never got to do, was and it was inspired by my own grandmother, or my mom, interviewing her grandmother, who lived from roughly 1880 to 1980. And in her life, she traveled across the Midwest in a covered wagon, and she flew on a 747 later in life. And I would see some of these elderly in China, and I would be like, I can't even imagine what they have lived through in, growing up, being born in 1930, 40, something like that in China, and later in life, seeing what China's become. So there's absolutely an enormous amount of pride in that. It's also created significant economic and financial stresses, which is what we're seeing now.
So we talked about real estate being part of this problem. What other things are contributing to the overall kind of bleak economic picture that you're saying China's facing now?
So I think basically the overall model is, and this is one of the reasons why we describe it as kind of like an event horizon. The overall model is basically reaching its ultimate endpoint, where you have to make significant changes, and the stresses are so great, it's just a question of which bad choice do you want. And what I mean by that is, as an approximate number, about 30% of the Chinese economy is related to real estate. And when we say 30%, we're talking, people buying appliances, steel that goes into rebar, or, stainless steel refrigerators, all the accompanying things that go with it. Well, if you take real estate and infrastructure, China's real estate market at this point is significantly overbuilt. Okay, there's a lot of apartments that will probably never be lived in the tens of millions range, and that has enormous amounts of financial pressures and things like that. So when we talk about these pressures, the question becomes, let's take a simple scenario. Out of the Chinese economy, you take 30% of that economy away, the real estate. Let's assume that no more apartments are going to get built in China starting today. Okay, where does that growth come from? Okay, I mean, where does that growth come from? Well, you could export, but China is now such a big number. For China to export its way out of these problems would literally require such imbalances in the global economy. I mean, there's imbalances now because of how much China exports. But if you say China's going to export its way out of these problems, you're talking just such imbalances on a scale that the world truly has never seen. And so think about it this way. The example I would use is, if you look at an economy in a simple way, there's three basic inputs, kind of like you're going to make brownies or a cake or something like that. There's three basic inputs into an economy. The number of people. Okay, so if you have more people, think of it like truck drivers. The more truck drivers you have, the more trucks you can drive and the more stuff you can move. Okay, same thing for an economy at large. Okay, so for many years, China's economy was benefiting from adding more workers to the workforce. Okay, well now the number of workers in China is actually declining, and in fact, it's been declining since about, I think, 2014 or so. So it's harder to grow your economy if you have fewer people in that economy.
A quick question about that. I know that's partially a shrinking population, but I also know youth unemployment is tremendously high. It's so high to, they were reporting it like 21%. Some people thought it was more like 40, 50%. Now they've just stopped reporting it entirely. So there are people who want jobs, but they can't find jobs.
And so this actually gets into a couple of issues. First of all, China has understandably placed a very real emphasis on improving higher education. I was part of that. I do think there have been real advances in the quality of Chinese higher education. But one of the outgrowths of that is that there are a lot of youth that do not want to take factory jobs. Okay. And so that still is an enormous foundation to the Chinese economy. So if you are leaving in China as a college graduate, there may be jobs, just not necessarily the jobs college graduates want to take. Another issue has been, and this gets to one of the inputs of Chinese economy is innovation. Basically, how much more productive is an economy, and according to most metrics, the Chinese economy since really let's as a simple dividing line, let's say the global financial crisis, has not become significantly more productive. And what we mean by more productive is, you have more people, you have more machines, but are people using those machines effectively? Okay, so that I, as a worker, am becoming more productive. Okay, and actually, productivity in China has actually been quite poor. According to some metrics, it might even be negative. At the very least, it's very, very slow. And so, as people decline, and as the number of, let's say, physical inputs, and when we talk about physical inputs, we're talking machines, things like that. The number of physical machines or hard capital isn't growing as fast. Can we be more productive with what we have? And that's one of the major problems, that China hasn't been productive. They aren't going to be productive because, and this is where you get back to what you said earlier about Communist Party policies. Economies aren't productive if they aren't competitive. Okay, if they can't be innovative, if they can't be creative. Okay, well, even this year, you look at where the overwhelming amount of bank financing is going. It's going to state-owned enterprises and state-linked enterprises. Okay, state-owned enterprises, whether it's China or anywhere else, are not known for their productivity. Okay, and so you actually look at the Chinese economy, and there are pockets. I want to emphasize there are pockets or sectors where you see very innovative and productive things going on, technological breakthroughs. As an economy, the economy very clearly is neither innovative nor productive, and unless that changes, you're going to see significant economic stagnation.
So what is the like practical outcome of having an unproductive, like you say productivity is negative? What does that mean for, people living in China?
So think about it. This actually has a direct impact on wages. And the best way I can think about it is let's assume that you work in a factory, and you say, hey, I have a sewing machine. Okay, well, I can sew X number of T-shirts per day because your boss is going to pay you $1 for every T-shirt that you sew or something like that. Okay. And then the boss says, well, and then you say to your boss, well, hey, boss, I actually wrote a program where I can actually control 10 sewing machines at the same time. Will you still pay me the same amount per T-shirt that I make if my computer code can run 10 different sewing machines at the same time? And he'll say, yeah, I'll pay you the same amount per T-shirt. And now you, as a worker, because you wrote a piece of code, you can actually make a lot more money. Okay, that's an example of productivity. Or maybe you know how to control that sewing machine, and you become a better sewer, so you can use that one sewing machine, so you can make more money to turn out more T-shirts. Okay, that's productivity. And at the end of the day, that's what drives wages. Okay, because think about it this way: if we buy 10 sewing machines, we still got to pay for those 10 sewing machines. Whether it's in what we call an implied hourly rate, because that sewing machine, I have to pay somebody, on a loan or whatever for those sewing machines. So people make more money by becoming more productive. Okay. Whether that's, becoming a better sewer, whether that's writing code to control 10 sewing machines, that's how wages grow. And that's one thing that we're actually not seeing in the Chinese economy. We're continuing to see low single digit wage growth and household income growth in China. And so when we talk about the Chinese economy growing at, say, 5-6%, what we're seeing in China is actually wage and household income growth a couple of percentage points lower, about, let's say, officially 3 to 4%.
So you said there's three main parts to an economy, and the first one was the number of people, and the second one is productivity. What's the third part?
That's the hardware capital. And so this is one of the things is when China has gone out and spent a lot of money on hard assets, whether it's a new university building, whether it's a new machine, things like that. And so one of the things is those have to be productive. Okay, those have to, we don't like to think of it, but even those assets, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a road, something like that, that needs to generate a rate of return to either pay for itself or If you're a sewing machine, you don't just go out and buy a sewing machine to sit there. That machine, you have to pay for that machine in some way. So that machine has to turn out X number of T-shirts. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with a bridge. And the example that people use is that is like high-speed rail, okay, or a bridge. And they say, well, it lends itself to social benefit, and that may well be true. That absolutely may well be true. But then that still has to be paid for somehow, maybe tax revenue, tax expenditures, or something like that. Otherwise, if those assets aren't being used, and if there isn't some type of revenue being assigned to that, that simply means that debts aren't being paid. Banks don't have the capital to lend, things like that. And that's actually what we're seeing in the financial sector is banks being very short of liquidity, banks being very short of capital because they aren't being repaid as much as they should.
So one of the hard assets you mentioned is universities. So the Chinese government has spent a lot of resources pushing higher education. And so, it's building or expanding universities, hiring faculty, and then, paying for the expenses of a student to be in a university for additional time. That is, maybe it's 4 years or whatever, but that's just, there's a lot of expenses that go into that, right? And so that has to contribute to productivity. And the idea, I guess, originally is that if you have a lot more educated people in China, then when they go find jobs after university, they will be more productive at those jobs. They'll know how to program 10 sewing machines, and so they'll increase productivity. But what's actually happening is you have millions of people who went through this very expensive university paid for by the government, and now there's no jobs for them. So they can't even be minimally productive.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is why, there's stories of, whether it's university graduates staying home or opting to open a noodle stand or something like that. And one of the issues is that these are people that just aren't allowed to be competitive. And one of the things that always amazed me when, because I would sit in on, the admissions process every year. That was part of my job, is just how competitive the Chinese university process was at every stage, undergraduate, graduate. I mean, it was amazingly competitive. And one of the things that the school, and this was, I think pretty universal in other schools I talked to and in my colleagues, people took great pride in that the university process was a very clean process. And it was very competitive. And it was very interesting. Why? Because people all throughout China felt that this was maybe the one chance in their entire life when it was on a level playing field with everybody. Okay.
So it's a meritocracy.
It was a meritocracy. It was a meritocracy. It was one of the only times where people felt everybody was on an even playing field.
Like, even if you're the son or daughter of a communist official, that wouldn't help you that much?
Because you still have to get a good Gaokao score in order to get into college.
Yes, absolutely. And so, I remember, my first year in China, I was talking with a student, and she told me she went to Peking University as an undergrad, and she came from a relatively populous province, and she told me she placed 10th in her province. And so, being, the newbie that I was at the time, I said, "Oh, you placed in the top 10 percentile. That's great." And she looked at me like I was a complete idiot, because there were probably, I went back and looked at the numbers. I just did some ballpark numbers. There were probably anywhere from about 500,000 to 750,000 kids that took the Gaokao in her province that year. And I said, and she looked at me, she's like, "No, professor, I placed 10th. Okay. And her parents were, as best I could tell, poor, relatively poor, not wealthy or anything like that. But people took great pride in the university system in China, that it was very equitable. And if you got a good score, you got a good score, no matter your background. And that was one of the few times people could compete evenly against anyone.
And so now, facing very little prospects of no jobs, for the men, probably no wife, since there's a huge gender imbalance. So what is the impact of this?
If you have a higher education, I think like the worst problem for men is actually like kind of like rural, less educated men are not going to find.
Yeah. But I mean, if
Yeah.
you're a college graduate who's staying at home and can't find a job and has no money
Or can't buy real estate.
or can't buy real estate,
That's still tough, yeah.
yeah.
Well, and one of the things I've heard is I've heard people with conspiracy theories about, why are all these Chinese coming across the border, from Mexico and things like that. And look, there statistically, there's probably some bad actors in that group. Okay, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But I've heard stories in other countries of the number of Chinese, even crossing into Vietnam has grown significantly. Trying to get across the border. And so what this tells me is that there's significant pressures and there just aren't jobs. And so a lot of people are saying, I need to go someplace to go get a job and have prospects for a better life.
It's interesting that, like, I think one of the things in the last 20 to 30 years, let's say a little longer, since reform and opening up, so since like the 1980s, that has been a backbone of the Chinese economy has been small businesses, right? Like the idea that you can actually open a business, you don't have to work for the state, you have the ability to like start a business, hire people, contribute to the economy. There was an interesting story in the New York Times last week featuring a woman who was like had this kind of dream. Like she grew up incredibly poor, got to the point where she was able to open up like essentially a chain of coffee shops in China, and then borrowed money from the banks to expand, like millions of yuan borrowed from the banks to expand, hired a lot of people, was a pretty large employer. And then COVID just completely, like the Chinese zero COVID policy completely destroyed her business. Like she wasn't able to keep her coffee shops open. She wasn't able to pay people when it came to the end. And then she was actually put in prison for like not being able to pay wages to her employees. And so like her entire business, this business that had hundreds of employees, was completely destroyed. And I wonder how many of those stories are going on in China right now, because like you said, a lot of the stuff that's going on with the stimulus policies, they're going into state-run companies. Like they're not going into like helping small businesses get bank loans, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I read that story, and it was pretty typical. I think it was also just heartbreaking for people like that. And I think that's really, when you talk about like the CCP policies, that's really the problem. Where we're seeing the money go is to defend state-owned enterprise, large businesses, things like that. If you look at the real estate sector, I mean, Evergrande has been bankrupt for basically 2 years. They're technically right now, I don't believe, maybe on some of their international bonds, but domestically, there's basically no ongoing legal process to basically what, as an American, we would think of as they're bankrupt, they're in bankruptcy proceedings, things like that. There's basically just been a pause on everything. Okay. And it's the same thing with Country Garden. They basically, the shareholders voted to basically put a pause on everything. So it's absolutely protecting companies like that and the SOEs and things like that. And the burden is absolutely falling on these private enterprises. And this is one of the things, is that those private enterprises even now are the biggest generators of job growth and innovation and things like that. Just earlier this week, I was reading an IMF paper about basically innovation in the Chinese economy, and what it shows is that young businesses in China within the first year to 3 years are incredibly productive and incredibly innovative and stuff like that, but it falls off quite dramatically as they age and other things like that. And there's a number of reasons for that. But those are absolutely the backbone. But right now, and especially under Xi Jinping, those types of businesses and opportunities are absolutely being stomped out.
Yeah, I was joking. Like when my parents were growing up in China, everybody worked for the state, right? Like you had a work unit, you like worked for the state, whether it was in a factory or whatever you were doing. And now it seems like they're going to go back to that with all the state-owned enterprises having like control of large parts of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I believe me, I would love to disagree, and it's one of those things. I mean, if you look at Xi Jinping, it's like that great saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. Is it's like, it's not exactly what China was experiencing in the '60s and '70s with a lot of the policies about, those work units and things like that. There's definitely a fair amount of rhyming going.
It seems, and another thing that is impacting the economy now is that it finally seems like a lot of international Western businesses are finally wising up to the scam of the Chinese economy and are pulling out. Uh, what impact is that having, and what do you think finally made these enterprises and companies realize now was the time to get out of China?
I think more than anything, it's just an accumulation of things. I don't think it's necessarily one specific thing. Just as a simple example, unless you're a Volkswagen type of company or something like that, and even they are under enormous pressure in different ways. It's just for various reasons. It's just the Chinese market is just very, very difficult. And then you start adding in things like, the data issues, and, you have to hire people, and then, you were shut down for 2 years. All these kinds of issues, education issues. I remember a number when I was starting out over there. A lot of people. China was absolutely seen among the MNC crowd, which they would do 3 years and then go back to the home office, and that was on the fast track to senior executive leadership type path. I don't think that is true of anymore. And even when I was there, that was rapidly falling out of favor. And so the senior, people that were on the fast track to senior leadership, China was no longer really the destination. And now that they've seen like just the returns, the financial pressures, and the other issues, people have said, you know what, we don't need to be doing business as much with China as much. And so you're absolutely seeing companies go elsewhere to get a lot of things done that they need elsewhere. So unless you're really targeting the Chinese market, you go other places to get your trading done.
I think you make a good point that it's not like a specific thing. I've seen a lot of reports about how it's, this anti espionage law, then there's more raids and investigations of Western companies operating in China. But that's been going on forever. Like, didn't we have Peter Humphrey on who, when did he have his thing?
Oh, he was 2013, 14.
Yeah. So this raids and investigations, this has been going on for over a decade at least.
And I think it's just gotten. I think it's one of those things where it's just Peter is great, and I think a lot of people just took it as kind of like a one-off, and now it's almost seen as that is standard operating procedure. What you might go through if you're there. The case that gathered a little bit of news attention recently was a company just doing statistical work in China. Not to mention, backgrounds and due diligence types reports that anybody that's going to sign a deal is going to want to go through. It's just, doing things that you just take for granted now are considered violations of national security. The one I saw recently from a banker was that China was restricting money market rate information as a matter of national security. Okay, this is like almost like CD rates at your bank are now considered national security rates, so that you're not even allowed to publish money market rates in real time.
So how do people or corporations know what kind of expected return to have if you can't even find the rates?
And that's the exact issue, and as to why people are saying, you know what, I don't need this. And I should say, I think there's one other background issue that is people also just very tangibly, and this is always the way capitalists work. They see just less money to be made. Okay, and so 5-10 years ago, China was probably had interest rates and that were about 4% higher than U.S. interest rates. And so by the, whether it was just, if you just did GDP growth as an investor, or if you just were investing in Chinese government bonds, you were probably doing okay. You were making solid money. Well, now U.S. interest rates are, probably almost, 3% higher than Chinese rates. And so people are saying, why do I need the hassle of dealing with China when I can stick my money in a U.S. government bond and earn 3% more than I would earn in China?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has always, one of its biggest pieces of propaganda is saying that it lifted, hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty. And they didn't. That's not true. It was largely foreign investment in China that helped pump up China's economy, and
also
Chinese people being able to do any kind of economic activity themselves.
Small businesses.
Yeah.
Right.
But with this flight of Western capital, what is that going to do to an already struggling Chinese economy?
Well, I think one of the ways to come full circle with all the financial pressures that China has in its banking system, real estate, their economic model, all of those kinds of issues, which we discussed earlier, is the only way for them to control those issues is to basically just tighten further. Okay. So, I've kind of jokingly referred to them in the past as a very large, they're basically the province known as Western North Korea. And that is the direction they have to go, because if they loosen in any way, that's simply going to create enormous problems. And I think this fits very well with the great leader's policy. The short version of what I think all indications are that he learned from 1989 when the USSR fell was do the exact opposite. And so he considers 1989 as one of the tragedy of the 20th century. And what the lessons that they've taken from that is no loosening, no relaxation of government controls. And in fact, to prevent that, the government should be even stronger, should be even more in control than ever before. And so that is, I think, the lesson that they've learned. I think that's how they're behaving, and I think that matches very closely with what we can expect in the future.
Rather than learning that communism doesn't work.
Yes.
Well, I mean, so the lesson is that Gorbachev made a mistake, right, in loosening government control over the economy.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's both ideological and an economic necessity for the CCP to tighten controls over everything. Can they just keep tightening controls and sort of, there'll be some problems, but ultimately it's going to sort of hold together?
I think that is what I consider the most likely scenario, in the sense that people have said, well, is there going to be a crisis? I mean, hey, as we've all learned from the past decade, absolutely anything is possible. I don't think you can consider that the most likely scenario. I think the scenario you just described, where they exert more and more control over everything. What is to prevent, for instance, the PBOC from just printing lots of extra money and buying bad loans from the government or from the banks and saying, okay, the banks have money to keep lending now. Okay. We're going to exert more and more control over the economy to make sure that there isn't an event. And so I think that what you've described is absolutely what I think is the highest likelihood scenario.
Well, the good thing is that, in the Chinese communist system, the People's Bank of China can print more money and not have to publicly disclose what's happening. So there's not going to be a consumer panic over inflation. It'll still cause inflation, but it won't be the panic kind necessarily. And I mean, it will cause further problems down the line when you essentially devalue your own currency. But those problems, fortunately, are in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the size of the Chinese banking industry, it's absolutely enormous, and they continue to lend. I added it up, and for many reasons, this is not a perfect comparison, but just as a simple example, if you added up the liabilities that the two real estate developers in the news, Country Garden and Evergrande, have right now, liabilities that people will probably recover 25 cents on the dollar at the end of the day. Those two amounts of liabilities are roughly the same amount as the entire amount of bad loans China says exist in all of China right now. Okay, those two companies alone are roughly equal to the amount of non-performing loans that China says that they have in the entire country.
So you're saying they're lying?
I think I'm beginning to suspect it's not entirely accurate. Okay.
Weird. So this would be the first time that the CCP has fudged statistics to make itself look better.
Especially economic statistics. They never do that.
They never do that. I'm as shocked as you are, guys. Okay. I'm blown away.
And I actually am wondering now that you talk about this increasing need for like party control, government control over the economy, how this is going to affect China's kind of expansionism, like economic expansionism abroad, things like the Belt and Road, because that was just an exercise in like exporting their excess capacity, right, to other countries. And like, hey, if you can't build any more bridges in Zhejiang, you're going to go build bridges in Africa or things like that. Like, is that a way out for them?
Let's put it this way. Just generally speaking, my default, and I say this is true of the US, this is true of China, this is my general default. We should never ascribe to malice what can easily be ascribed by incompetence. Okay. And so when we talk about Belt and Road, I think there's a lot less malice there than there just is incompetence. And what I mean by that is, I don't think there was ever any serious plan. I think a lot of the basic indications is that Xi Jinping walked into a room and said, guys, I got this great idea. Let's lend money to Africa. This can't lose. Okay. And so everybody beneath him said, okay, guys, let's go out and start lending money to Africa and other places like this and do that. And then they figured it out as they went along. Okay. Because if you look at the amount of capacity, for instance, that is being soaked up by Africa or other places, in the background of China, it's not even a rounding error. Okay, I mean it's basically irrelevant. And so you look at some of the projects that they did, and one of the things is a book that had an impact on my thinking about the U.S. is if you go back and look at what the U.S. did a lot of post World War II in shaping the international environment, they basically took a lot of the technical institutions and made them international technical institutions. Okay, the WTO, different things like that are basically just, they basically have U.S. type of counterparts, for lack of a better term. And so I say that because I think China went out and acted in a very Chinese way internationally. Okay, and so you look at like Sri Lanka, they built this port. I don't think at the beginning there was any let's say, malice intended to say, let's go out and build something that is going to be a complete failure so that we can have a PLA base. Okay. It was probably just said, guys, you got an ocean. What can we do with it? Hey, tell you what, let's wildly expand this port. And the one that I think has gotten a lot less attention in Sri Lanka is they built this massive airport in literally like the middle of Sri Lanka, not anywhere near anything. And now, I saw this documentary there's literally like wild animals roaming this unused airport. Okay. And so I say this not really to defend China, but to say they didn't really think it through. They went out and behaved like China behaves domestically. And they built a bunch of stuff that may or may not ever be used, because that's the Chinese model. And that's the problems that they're running into now domestically as well as internationally with Belt and Road.
So rather than this well thought out comprehensive plan to become a global military power and take over the world, it's just them juggling things and seeing what sticks.
I think that's in my estimation, I think that's a much more accurate view of I think what unfolded.
Well, so how about this? Because this is something a lot of people are commenting on now, that like, well, the out for China is a war. wars can make lots of money. It can distract from a lot of problems. What do you think about that? Like, is war China's solution to its economy?
So I'm actually when you look at, so I think there's two answers to that. I've been on record, and I can probably find it somewhere for some time saying, I think you have to look at within 18 months to 2 years of Xi Jinping's third term, that China is going to do something on Taiwan. Okay. And this was before their current economic issues. And I think that's still a very reasonable thing. And you look at how they're behaving, just if you guys have seen the map that China released this week, basically they pissed off pretty much every one of their neighbors by claiming some part of Russia, some part of India. I mean, they're even claiming Filipino territorial waters. I mean, they basically, if you're remotely close to China, they're probably claiming part of you. And so I think there's two answers to that. This was who China was before their current economic issues. So in a way, China's not really changing. Okay. The economic issues now may speed up that process a little bit. It may delay it. It may cause them to be a little bit more aggressive. It hasn't changed China in any way. I mean, this is who China was before these economic issues. It's who they're going to be for the foreseeable future. The current economic issues might nudge things forward or backwards a little bit, but it hasn't changed who China is at all.
So one of the things that China seems to have been doing well on economically lately is green technology. That is, as countries around the world, the Western countries are looking to implement more policies related to climate change and renewable energy. China has come in and said, well, we'll build your solar panels and wind turbines.
If we're talking about innovation and productivity.
Right.
Well, I mean, except that a lot of that innovation was actually stolen from...
Yeah, innovative stealing.
It was innovative stealing. And one of the latest things is electric vehicles, which also were not an original Chinese innovation. But now China is exporting more cars than I think any other country. They've surpassed Japan. Most of these cars they're exporting, I understand, are electric vehicles. And while you can't buy them in the United States yet, certainly like Australia and the UK are now starting to see these like BYD Chinese electric cars on the market. So is this good for China, and is this good for the West?
So there's a couple answers to that. So just briefly touch upon the macro issue. I think one of the issues, the environmentalism, I'm not an expert on this, but I've definitely read enough to say, I think it bears worth examining whether or not electrical vehicles are the environmental panacea that they have, that their supporters have made them out to be. Because this is an enormous, to create the batteries for a single car creates an enormous amount of environmental issues, from how the electricity is generated to the mining of the metals. Most cars have anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of metal in them, which make them, which requires a lot of mining. So I think that's the first issue.
So there's a lot more input than like a combustion engine.
An enormous amount more. And there's even some real interesting studies on the life cycle emissions of EVs, meaning from the time metal gets pulled out of the ground till the time that car gets scrapped, what is the life cycle emission of things? And you account for how the electricity is generated. And it's basically a lot more mixed than I think, we think of an EV as like, oh, I'm environmentally friendly. It's actually a lot, depending on some different factors. It's quite possible that it's actually negative for the environment. But more specifically, I think one of the things that people need to consider, especially when we're talking about China, is that these are basically mobile surveillance devices, and EVs are fundamentally different than combustion engine cars. They typically have about 1/10 the number of moving parts or parts, period, as compared to an EV or compared to a combustion engine. And then they also have a lot more semiconductors. And so, I can speak firsthand the amount of data that China gathers on cars and EVs within China. You can even count, for instance, which seatbelts are buckled, who's driving it, all kinds of things like that. I can tell you one that made me laugh. It was basically a software program that truckers used in China, so that it limited the number of hours a truck could be driven for safety reasons and things like that. But one of the things that I found funny was is it actually recorded the party membership of truck drivers. Okay, their political affiliation, which I was like, I'm not sure why that matters for truck driving safety, but hey, this is China we're talking about.
Red asphalt.
It was puzzling, but. And so, so we can't say for certain that China is actually collecting data on those cars that are exported, simply because I haven't seen it. But they use the same components, batteries, and one of the reasons that batteries are very important is that's kind of like the heart and the brain of an electrical vehicle is the battery. Because the battery interfaces with every individual unit, from the entertainment to braking, things like that. If you think about, let's assume you were talking about a 50-year-old car, that is actually a manual procedure. So you press the brake, and that actually pushes the brakes. Okay. In an electrical vehicle, when you push the brakes, you're not actually pushing the brakes. You're pushing something, and that sends a signal electronically. Hey, we need to tap the brakes, but you're not actually pushing the brakes. You're pushing something that sends a signal. Okay. So it's a very different thing. And so that's why those EVs matter, because those are like the heart and the brain. They collect all of that data, and China having access to that source code and data is a very real security risk.
So a typical Chinese electric vehicle might have something like a built-in GPS, onboard microphone for voice activation, cameras for, emergency braking or lane detection and so on.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
So you're saying that in theory, at least, all of those things could be used to collect data on the user for purposes other than the safety of driving that car.
Yes, absolutely. And if you extend it a step further, if you think of, and some of this is in non-self-driving cars, but there's these things that are called like LiDAR or cameras. So for instance, it will create electronic pictures, and not just the visual pictures that, like, as I look at you through the camera today, but basically radar type pictures. It's like, oh, there's the shape of a rock, and here is the bend in the road and stuff like that, so that it can recognize when to turn and lane markers and things like that. Basically radar type pictures as these cars drive. And so if that data is being collected and transported, sent back to China, that's absolutely very real risks. And it also creates risks where if that source code is being created in China, one thing we know about Huawei, for an example, is it's very difficult to attribute intent. Did you mean to do something? Okay. But one thing we can say about most Chinese electronic devices is they have little to no security. So are you doing that hoping to hack the device? Well, it's difficult to attribute intent. We can say, I know that you have put no security in that, and it would be very easy for you to get into the device. And so
there's a plot point in this show that came out about 10 years ago called Person of Interest, which is like this future surveillance state when you have like a machine that can sort of read and predict everything through cameras. In one of the episodes, there was a plot point where someone's car was electronically taken over, and like they couldn't use the brakes and they couldn't steer, and there was an intentional crash done through a sort of software hack. Is that something that now in 2023 could actually happen with a Chinese vehicle, or is that still science fiction?
That's so. I should say, in a degree of fairness, that's absolutely possible in electronic vehicles and definitely self-driving vehicles, but really more broadly electronic vehicles. But it's also a lot easier with Chinese vehicles because of the level of security and let's say a security intelligence apparatus like China having the source code. Okay, having the source code. Think about it this way: if you're driving some random car, I have to figure out which car you're driving. Okay, I then have to get into that specific car or something like that. It's at the very least a lot harder to do that than if I say, I know Matt is driving a Chinese-made vehicle, and I have the source code so that I can get into that source code immediately. Okay, and I have the data streaming back to me. Okay, so where I know where he is, I know the car he's driving, I know the security weak deficiencies of the car that he's driving.
And so theoretically, if I did something to upset the Chinese Communist Party, like, I don't know, participating in a subversive podcast, it is theoretically possible for them to cause an accident, turn off the airbag and accelerate and turn off the brakes, right?
That's absolutely possible, and we can say with zero hesitation, based upon the data we know they collect on drivers in China with the same components of BYD cars, for instance, that get shipped around the world, that they absolutely have the capacity to monitor, record, and they do monitor and record Chinese drivers with those components.
Well, you mentioned the truck drivers, and they're limited to certain hours, so you sort of must have some kind of central surveillance that limits that, right? Or is it just the individual trucks?
So there's different systems with the truck driver, and again, to a degree of fairness, we have similar there's similar functionality on 18-wheelers in the United States for some trucks, where basically they are, as a simple example, and I don't know the trucking regulations, but it's something like you as an individual driver are limited to 8 hours a day of driving or something like that. So you get into the cab of the truck and you log in with either a face or a personal PIN code or something like that, so that they can say, you're driving 8 hours a day. We verified that you're driving 8 hours a day, and you're not trying to do a 16-hour day and potentially endangering other people.
Okay. So that's not really the same thing then.
That's not really so truck driving systems are not really the same as automobiles. Automobiles, they absolutely can track automobiles in real time, because those as a simple example, most any modern automobile comes with like 5G enabled communication, so they can easily track that car anywhere and identify who's driving that and control the mics and different things like that with zero hesitation. Yes.
And I think so. What's particularly sad about this is, a lot of Western countries trying to promote green energy is basically empowering China to use this as a weapon. Australia, I know, is offering big rebates for buying an electric vehicle, such that makes Chinese electric vehicles much cheaper than any other kind of electric vehicle. And so, I know.
It's for example, like if you to buy an electric vehicle, you get the rebate, right?
Yeah.
In Australia, I think it's like 6,000 Aussie dollars or something, and then once you factor that in, it might be cheaper to buy an electric vehicle from China than like a standard Toyota Corolla or something.
Yeah. And we know that the Chinese Communist Party is very interested in controlling Australian society. That was a huge thing, and particularly the Chinese diaspora in Australia.
But even if it's not surveillance, like think about this: Australia starts to become dependent on Chinese cars, so other manufacturers aren't sending the cars to Australia, so there's not as many of those. And you have like the maintenance of those Chinese cars all sort of have to follow a certain system. So you're sort of building that in, and it makes the Australian society more and more dependent on just another aspect of trade with China.
And if China goes to war for Taiwan, they have another lever.
I'm just imagining the Great China Car Uprising. in Australia, like all the cars like start having a mind of
It's
their
like
own.
that movie that was on TV when I was a kid all the cars came to life and killed people, and
Talking
it
about
terrified
Cars,
me.
the Pixar thing.
Pixar thing. That's the sequel to this movie. After the cars killed
After the made-for-TV movie you saw as a kid.
I wish if anyone watching knows what that is called. It's like just a memory from my childhood.
What
There was
era
like a
of
truck.
movie?
It must have been like the 80s or maybe early 90s. There was a truck that had like this gremlin face. I think all the electronic appliances. I want to know what that is. Internet, tell me. Chris, China's turned off your lights.
I know. I wanted to. Let me. I'm not sure. I have one of those lights that is for this type of thing, and it just turned off, and I'm not sure why. So
it's okay.
I think we know exactly why.
No.
Was it made in China?
Let's lean into this. Now coming to us is this anonymous person who has a secret. This is you'll want to watch because this is exciting. Tell us the secret, anonymous person. We'll call you Mr. B.
But I think we should wrap it up. But to bring this back to the Chinese economy, like, is this electric vehicle or green technology going to save China's economy, or is it just not enough?
No, it's just not enough, and you're already starting. I mean, these electrical vehicle makers, the battery makers, things like that, they're receiving enormous subsidies, and they're still loss making and things like that. And so you're already starting to see stories pop up of in a similar fashion that there were these basically like bike graveyards. You're already starting to see stories about fields of Chinese EVs that have just been put out to pasture. So it's absolutely not going to save the Chinese economy for sure.
But Xi Jinping's 5-year semiconductor plan is definitely going to do it.
See, you're just doing that to trigger me now.
I mean, that's the terrible thing about authoritarian systems. You just have like one guy who can be like, "Hey, I got a great idea," and then everyone has to follow it and can't be like, "Actually, there are some serious problems with that idea."
And that's look, I'm not trying to defend China, but that's why I like, especially with like the Belt and Road or something like that. A lot of these are really just somebody says, "Hey, I've got an idea," and everybody else just nods and agrees. And the next thing you know, there's some crazy idea being pursued.
I mean, Chris, you experienced this in China yourself. Like, the best thing to do in this scenario is jump on the bandwagon.
Yes.
To get some of those subsidies, right?
I will tell you a story. I had a student at one time, and he comes to me and he says, "Oh, I got a job teaching English to this Chinese tech firm." And I was like, "Oh, great, good." So I see him, and he had done a little coding, nothing serious. Had probably taken like 1 or 2 coding classes or something like that. And I see him a couple weeks later, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm working part-time at this tech company." And I was like, "Oh, great, teaching English?" He's like, "No, I'm running their tech stuff." And I was like, "Wait a minute, they were a tech company. How are you running their tech stuff?" He's like, "Well, they were a tech startup, but they didn't have anybody that knew how to code, and so they were getting government subsidies, and so I'm teaching them how to code."
Wow.
Incredible.
Now that's innovation.
Well, thank you for taking the great personal risk to come and speak to us anonymously, Mr. B. I hope you're protected from the Chinese EVs. But it's been great having you back on.
And if people want to follow you, anonymous Mr. B, on platforms such as X, formerly known as Twitter, where can they find you?
And just as a little piece of advice, to your listeners, tell them, make sure they do not go on the internet and Google, "I'm looking for X." Okay, that all kinds of bad results. Okay.
Why? What would come up? Just a second. Oh my God.
So where can they follow you on X?
Balding's World. I'm at the handle Balding's World on. I'm just gonna say Twitter. Okay, I can't say X. Okay, just.
I don't
Balding's
think
World
anybody's saying X,
Twitter.
honestly.
X marks the spot.
I said X, but only to troll you. All right.
All right. Well, yeah, pleasure having you on. We'll put a link to that below, and yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. These are very interesting times for China.
It's that old fake Chinese proverb: "May you live in interesting times."
Said by Deng Xiaoping's cats.
Hey, thanks so much, guys.
And thank you for joining us. Remember that name of the movie. Tell me what it is.
Maybe we can ask Matt Suit for the name of the movie.
Because it's so loud.
I was going to say it's from the 80s.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I've been sitting on a comment about Matt Suit the entire hour-long podcast.
Wow. It's nice to know that that's what you were focused on this whole time, Shelley.
I can multitask. You know, China's economic collapse, killer cars are coming for us all, and Matt is Magnum PI.
Yes.
With the mustache and everything.
Yeah, just need the sunglasses.
Oh, I'm sure he's got them.
I actually do.
And once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll talk to you.
At least Halloween's sorted for you this year, right?
It is.
Oh.